Clara Bennett woke with a jolt, her heart slamming against her ribs before her eyes even opened. Somewhere close by, footsteps echoed on stone, slow and deliberate, coming nearer with every second. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then the smell of old leather and cold ash reached her, and her stomach dropped. She was sitting in the Duke's chair, his chair, the one no servant was allowed to touch, let alone sleep in. She sat up so fast her head spun. The fire in the grate had burned down to a few dying embers, and the candle she had brought in with her had melted into a puddle of wax on the side table. Outside the tall windows, the sky was still black, but the footsteps in the hallway told her that morning duties had already begun somewhere in the house. Someone was awake. Someone was walking this way. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. She could not remember falling asleep. She remembered coming in past midnight to lay fresh coal for the morning fire, as she did every night, in every room on the east wing, including the study that belonged to Duke Edmund Hartley. She remembered how her legs had ached after a 16-hour day of scrubbing floors, carrying water, and mending linens. She remembered sitting down for just one moment to catch her breath. One moment had turned into hours. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Clara shot up out of the chair, nearly stumbling over the edge of the rug. Her mind raced through every possible excuse, and found none of them believable. There was no reasonable explanation for a housemaid to be found asleep in the private study of the coldest, most feared nobleman in the county, sitting in the one chair he allowed no one else to sit in, not even his own aunt. She had heard the stories, the same as every other servant in Hartley Manor. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A single look from him was enough to send grown men scrambling to correct their mistakes. He had dismissed a footman once for arriving 2 minutes late to open a carriage door. He had gone an entire winter without speaking more than a few words to anyone in the household beyond simple instructions. Some of the older staff whispered that he had not always been this way, that something had changed him years ago, but no one dared ask what. And now Clara was about to become the newest story whispered through the servants' hall, except this one would end with her dismissal, and likely without a reference. Without a reference, she would have nothing. Her mother back in the village depended on the wages Clara sent home every month. Her younger brother needed shoes for the coming winter. There would be no second chance if she lost this position. The door handle turned. Clara's mouth went dry. She thought about diving behind the tall bookshelf near the window, but there was no time, and even if there had been, hiding would only make things worse if she were discovered. She thought about rushing past whoever was entering and pretending she had simply come in to tend the fire, but her legs would not move. She stood frozen exactly where she was, in front of the Duke's own chair, as the door swung open. It was not a footman. It was not the housekeeper making her early rounds. It was the Duke himself, already dressed for the day in a dark coat, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He stopped in the doorway the instant he saw her, his hand still on the handle, and for several long seconds, neither of them said a word. Clara's mind screamed at her to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no sound came out. She simply stood there, her cap slightly crooked from sleep, her apron creased, staring at the one man in the house whose displeasure could end everything she had worked for. The Duke's gaze moved from her face to the chair behind her, then back again. Something crossed his expression, something Clara could not name, gone as quickly as it appeared. He did not shout. He did not summon the steward. He simply stood there, studying her the way a man might study something unfamiliar and unexpected, something he had not planned for, and did not quite know what to do with. "You are the girl who tends the fires," he said finally. His voice was low, quieter than she expected, without the sharp edge the rumors had promised. "Yes, my lord," Clara managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came in past midnight to lay the coal. I sat down only for a moment. I did not mean to fall asleep. I do not know how it happened. I am terribly sorry, my lord. It will never happen again, I promise you." She realized she was talking too fast, the words tumbling over one another, but she could not stop herself. Every servant knew that the worst thing you could do in front of the Duke was babble, yet here she was, doing exactly that, unable to control the fear pouring out of her. He held up one hand, and she fell silent immediately. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. He simply looked at the chair, at the dead fire, at the melted candle, and then at her again. Clara braced herself for the words she was certain would come next.
"You are dismissed."
Collect your things, do not return. Instead, he asked a question she never expected. Are you unwell? Clara blinked, certain she had misheard him. My lord? You look exhausted, he said, his tone still even, still quiet. More than exhausted. When did you last sleep a full night? She did not know how to answer that. No one in this house had ever asked her such a thing, least of all the Duke, who rarely spoke to the staff at all, beyond issuing instructions through the housekeeper. Clara searched his face for some sign of sarcasm or anger hiding beneath the question, some trap she was about to fall into, but she found none. He appeared, if anything, genuinely curious. I could not say, my lord, she admitted finally. There is always work to be done before the household wakes. Something shifted in his expression again, faster this time, and he looked away from her, toward the window where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to creep over the hills. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, quieter still, almost as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. No one has fallen asleep in this room in a very long time. Clara did not know what to make of that statement, nor did she have the courage to ask what he meant by it. She simply stood as still as possible, waiting for whatever judgment was coming, whatever punishment he had decided upon during those long silent moments. Go and rest, he said at last. You will not be needed until midday. Clara stared at him, certain this was some kind of test, a way of drawing out her guilt so he could later reveal her dismissal with greater satisfaction. But his expression held no such cruelty. He looked, strangely, almost as tired as she felt, though in a different way entirely, as though something inside him had been disturbed and had not yet settled back into place. My lord, I do not wish to presume, but should I not first explain to the housekeeper what happened, so there is no confusion about my absence? I will speak with Mrs. Farrow myself, he said. There is no need for you to explain anything further. Go. It was not a harsh command, though it carried the same quiet authority all his words seemed to carry. Clara curtsied quickly, murmured her thanks, and hurried from the room before he could change his mind, before whatever strange mercy had taken hold of him could pass. She did not look back as she pulled the door shut behind her, though some part of her wanted to understand what exactly had just happened, why the coldest man in the county had looked at her the way he had, as though she were a puzzle he had not expected to encounter before breakfast. She hurried down the servants' corridor, her legs shaking with relief and confusion in equal measure, and did not stop until she reached the small room she shared with another maid near the kitchens. Grace Whitmore was already awake, pulling on her apron, and she looked up in surprise as Clara burst through the door. You look as though you have seen a ghost, Grace said. Where have you been? I thought you had already gone down to the kitchens. Clara sank onto the edge of her narrow bed, her hands still trembling. Grace, I fell asleep, in the study, in his chair. Grace's eyes went wide, and for a moment she said nothing at all, simply staring at Clara, as though waiting for the rest of the sentence to reveal itself as some kind of joke. His chair, she repeated slowly. The Duke's chair. You fell asleep in it. Yes. And he found you there. Yes. Grace sat down heavily on her own bed, across the small room, her expression somewhere between horror and disbelief. Clara, you must pack your things at once. There is no possible way he will allow you to remain in this house after such a thing. My aunt worked in a house where a girl was dismissed for arranging the flowers wrong in the master's study, and that was nothing compared to what you have just described. He did not dismiss me, Clara said quietly, still trying to make sense of it herself. He told me to go and rest. He asked if I was unwell. He said I would not be needed until midday. Grace stared at her, as though she had grown a second head. He said what? I know how it sounds. It sounds impossible, Grace said flatly. Clara, this is the same man who dismissed poor Thomas for arriving late with the carriage. The same man who has not smiled once in the 2 years I have worked in this house. You are telling me he found you asleep in his private chair, and instead of throwing you out into the road, he told you to rest? Clara nodded slowly, still turning the strange encounter over in her mind. There had been something in his face, something she could not quite name, some flicker of feeling behind the usual coldness the rest of the household described. It had unsettled her more than his anger would have. Anger she could have understood, anger she could have prepared herself for. But this quiet, careful concern from a man known throughout the county for having none to spare made no sense to her at all. Perhaps he is planning something worse, Grace said, lowering her voice, as though the walls themselves might carry word back to the main house. Perhaps he wishes to speak with Mrs. Farrow first, to decide how best to make an example of you before the rest of the staff. My aunt always said that gentlemen like him prefer to plan these things carefully rather than act in the heat of the moment. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through Clara's chest, and she pulled her knees up to her chest on the narrow bed, wrapping her arms around them. It was possible. It was, in fact, the more sensible explanation, far more sensible than the alternative, which was that the Duke of Hartley Manor, a man known for his icy reserve in every corner of the county, had simply chosen to show her an unexpected kindness, for no reason at all. I should go down and speak with Mrs. Farrow myself, Clara said, rising from the bed despite her exhaustion. It is better that she hears my account before anyone else's version reaches her. He said he would speak with her himself, Grace reminded her. Then I should be there when he does, in case he changes his account of things, or in case she has questions only I can answer. Grace caught her arm before she could reach the door. Clara, think carefully. If he told you to rest, and you appear anyway, looking as though you cannot follow even the simplest instruction, you may undo whatever strange mercy he has shown you. Sometimes the wisest thing a person can do is exactly what they have been told, and nothing more. Clara hesitated at the door, torn between her instinct to smooth things over immediately and the sense, quiet but growing, that Grace was right. She had been given an order, however unusual, and disobeying it now would serve no one, least of all herself. She let her hand fall from the door handle and returned slowly to her bed, though sleep felt impossible now, with her mind turning over every second of the encounter, searching for some detail she had missed, some explanation for why the Duke's expression had softened the way it had when he looked at her. She thought of the way his eyes had lingered on the chair before returning to her face, the way his voice had dropped almost to nothing when he said no one had fallen asleep in that room in a very long time. There was a story behind those words, she was certain of it, though she could not begin to guess what it might be. The servants spoke often of tragedy in the Duke's past, though the details shifted depending on who told the tale. Some said he had lost a brother, others spoke of a betrothal that had ended badly, though none of the older staff would say more than that, as though the subject itself were forbidden. Whatever the truth of it, something about that quiet, empty chair meant more to him than an ordinary piece of furniture, and something about finding her asleep in it had struck a nerve he clearly had not expected to feel struck. Clara did not know whether to be relieved or afraid of what that might mean for her in the days ahead. Down below, in the servants' hall, whispers had already begun to spread, carried by the two under-footmen who had seen Clara hurrying from the east wing with her cap askew and her face pale as milk. By the time the kitchen maids arrived to begin preparing breakfast, at least 3 different versions of the story were circulating, each one more dramatic than the last, though none of them yet contained the truth, which even Clara herself could not fully explain. Mrs. Farrow, the housekeeper, heard the first whispers as she made her morning rounds, and though she said nothing to confirm or deny them, her expression grew increasingly tight as she moved from room to room, clearly waiting for the moment the Duke would summon her to discuss whatever had occurred. She found Clara's absence from her usual morning duties unusual enough on its own, and when she learned that the girl had been told to rest until midday, on the Duke's own instruction, her carefully composed face betrayed the smallest flicker of genuine surprise, quickly hidden again beneath her usual stern efficiency. For his part, the Duke remained in his study long after Clara had gone, standing at the window that overlooked the eastern gardens, watching the sun climb slowly over the frost-covered hedges below. He did not call for his valet. He did not ring for tea. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at nothing in particular, his mind clearly somewhere else entirely. The chair behind him sat exactly as it always had, dark leather worn smooth by years of use, though he found himself glancing back at it more than once, as though expecting to find it occupied again. It had been 8 years since anyone but himself had sat in that chair, 8 years since the last time someone had fallen asleep in this room while waiting for him, curled against the cold in a way that had struck something deep and unguarded within him the moment he saw it again this morning, something he had believed long buried beyond reach. He did not know why the sight of an exhausted housemaid asleep in his study had affected him so deeply, why his carefully maintained composure had cracked, even briefly, in a way it had not cracked in years. He only knew that something in him, something he had thought entirely frozen over, had stirred for the first time in a very long while, and he was not at all certain what to do about it. Downstairs, Clara finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her mind still full of questions she could not answer, unaware that in the study above her, the man known throughout the county for his unyielding coldness was standing very still, staring at an empty chair, feeling something he had not allowed himself to feel in 8 long years, and beginning, without quite realizing it yet, to become someone slightly different than the man he had been the night before. By the time Clara woke again, well past noon, the entire household had heard some version of what had happened in the East Wing study. In a house as large as Hartley Manor, secrets rarely survived the morning, and this one had traveled from the scullery to the stables before the church bells in the village had even finished ringing for midday. The versions of the story varied wildly depending on who was telling it, but every single one agreed on the central fact that seemed impossible to most of the staff, that Clara Bennett had been found asleep in the Duke's chair, and that the Duke had not punished her for it. In the kitchens, the cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Mrs. Pruitt, shook her head over her mixing bowl and declared to anyone who would listen that she had worked at Hartley Manor for 11 years and had never once heard of the Duke showing mercy to anyone, servant or otherwise. Her late husband had worked in the stables and had told her stories of the Duke's father, a hard man in his own right, but even he had not carried the particular chill that seemed to follow the current Duke through every room he entered. "It is not natural," Mrs. Pruitt said, punctuating her words with a firm press of her rolling pin into the dough before her. "A man does not change overnight without a reason, and I would very much like to know what that reason is." Beatrice, the youngest of the housemaids, only 15 years old, and still new enough to the household to find everything about it fascinating, leaned across the work table with wide eyes. "Perhaps he fancies her," she whispered, earning a sharp look from Mrs. Pruitt that sent her scurrying back to her polishing. "Do not speak nonsense in this kitchen," Mrs. Pruitt said. "The Duke does not fancy anyone. He has not looked twice at a woman since Lady Eleanor." The mention of that name caused a brief, heavy silence to settle over the kitchen, the kind of silence that told Clara, when she finally came downstairs to help with the afternoon preparations, that there was a story here far deeper than anything she had yet been told. She had heard the name mentioned in passing before, always in hushed tones, always followed by a quick change of subject, as though the very syllables carried some kind of danger with them. Who was Lady Eleanor? Clara asked quietly, once Mrs. Pruitt had stepped out to check on the bread ovens and would not overhear. Grace glanced toward the doorway before answering, lowering her voice even further. She was to marry the Duke, years ago, before either of us came to work here. I have only heard the story from the older staff, and even they do not agree on all the details, but everyone says she was to become his wife, and that something happened before the wedding could take place. What happened? No one will say for certain. Some claim she fell ill and died very suddenly. Others say there was an accident, and there are those, though they only whisper it when they are certain no one from the family can hear, who say she left him at the very last moment, just days before the wedding, and that no one has ever learned why. Clara found herself unable to stop thinking about this as she carried linens down the long corridor toward the laundry room, her mind drifting back to the strange stillness in the Duke's eyes that morning, the way he had looked at the empty chair as though it held some memory too painful to name aloud. If Lady Eleanor had once sat in that very chair, waiting for him the way Clara had, quite by accident, waited without meaning to, then perhaps she understood now why finding another woman there had shaken him so deeply. She did not have long to dwell on the thought, however, because as she rounded the corner toward the laundry, she nearly collided with Mr. Colin Ashford, the estate steward, a tall, thin man, with sharp features and an even sharper manner, who managed the household finances and staff schedules with a precision that left little room for error, and even less room for kindness. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice carrying the particular coldness he reserved for staff he considered troublesome, "I understand you were absent from your morning duties." Clara's stomach tightened immediately. "The Duke himself gave me leave to rest, Mr. Ashford. He said he would inform Mrs. Farrow." "He did inform her," Ashford said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "Which is precisely what concerns me. In all my years managing this household, I have never known His Grace to grant such leave to any servant, for any reason. I find myself wondering what could possibly have occurred to warrant such an exception." "I fell asleep while tending the fire, sir," It was an accident, nothing more. An accident that resulted in special favor, Ashford said. You will forgive me if I find that difficult to accept at face value. I would advise you, Miss Bennet, to be very careful in the days ahead. This household runs on order and discipline, and I will not have that order disrupted, regardless of what has caught His Grace's momentary attention. There was something in the way he said momentary attention that made Clara's cheeks burn, though she could not entirely name why. It felt as though he were accusing her of something, though she had done nothing beyond falling asleep from sheer exhaustion, and she had certainly not sought out any special treatment from a man whose reputation had frightened her long before she had ever exchanged a single word with him. I have no wish to disrupt anything, sir, she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. I only wish to do my work well and keep my position. Ashford studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally giving a curt nod and continuing down the corridor without another word. Clara stood there for a moment longer, her heart still pounding, before gathering the linens she had dropped and hurrying the rest of the way to the laundry room, Ashford's warning echoing uncomfortably in her mind. The rest of the afternoon passed in the same tense atmosphere, with staff members glancing at her sideways whenever she passed, some with open curiosity, others with something closer to suspicion. Only Grace remained openly kind, staying close to Clara's side throughout their shared duties, and steering conversation away from the subject whenever another servant attempted to pry for details. It was near evening, as Clara made her way back toward the east wing to begin the fire-tending duties she had missed that morning, that she encountered the Duke again, this time in the long gallery that connected the main house to the study wing. He was standing before one of the family portraits, his hands clasped behind his back in the same posture she had seen that morning, though this time his expression seemed even more distant, more lost in thought than before. She hesitated, uncertain whether to continue past him or wait until he had moved on, but before she could decide, he turned and saw her standing there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Miss Bennet, he said finally, his voice quiet in the vast empty gallery. My lord. Clara dropped into a quick curtsy, her eyes lowered. I trust you managed to rest. Yes, my lord, thank you. I am grateful for your understanding. He was quiet for a moment, and when Clara dared to glance up, she found him studying her with the same careful, searching expression from that morning, as though he were trying to solve some puzzle she did not know she presented. It was no great kindness, he said eventually. Any reasonable employer would show the same consideration to an exhausted servant. Clara thought of Mrs. Pruitt's words in the kitchen, of 11 years without a single act of mercy, but she said nothing of it, only nodding in response. Still, I am grateful, my lord. He glanced toward the portrait beside him, a painting of a woman with dark hair and a gentle, knowing smile, dressed in the fashion of perhaps a decade past. Clara had passed this portrait many times before without paying it much attention, one among dozens of family paintings lining the gallery walls, but something in the way the Duke looked at it now told her this particular painting held more weight than the others. My sister, he said, without being asked, surprising Clara so much that she nearly forgot to respond. She is lovely, my lord. She died when I was 23. A fever, sudden and merciless. The physicians could do nothing. His voice remained perfectly level as he spoke, though something in the stillness of his posture told Clara the words cost him more than his tone suggested. She used to sit in that chair in my study, when we were children, while I studied at the desk. She said it was the most comfortable seat in the entire house, and she was not wrong. Clara did not know what to say. She had expected, based on the servants' whispers, some story involving Lady Eleanor, some tale of romantic betrayal or tragic loss connected to marriage. But this was something different entirely, something that had clearly been hidden even from the household staff who thought they knew every detail of the Duke's past. I am very sorry, my lord, she said softly. I did not know. No one does, beyond my aunt and a handful of the older staff who were here at the time. It is not a story I care to have repeated through the servants' hall. He turned to look at her directly then, his pale eyes holding hers in a way that made her chest tighten strangely. I tell you only because I think you deserve to understand why this morning affected me the way it did. It was not your presence in the chair that troubled me, Miss Bennet. It was how natural it looked. How right, in a way I had not seen in 8 years. Clara felt her breath catch, uncertain how to respond to such an admission from a man who, by all accounts, never spoke of his private feelings to anyone, let alone to a housemaid he barely knew. "I am honored that you would share such a thing with me, my lord," she managed finally. "I did not mean to disturb a memory so precious to you." "You did not disturb it," he said quietly. "You returned it to me, if only for a moment." He seemed to catch himself then, some awareness passing over his features that he had said more than he intended, and his posture straightened slightly, the careful distance returning to his voice. "Forgive me. I do not know why I have told you this." "There is nothing to forgive, my lord." He nodded once, then turned back toward the portrait, and Clara understood the conversation had reached its natural end. She curtsied again, and continued on, toward the study, to begin her evening duties, her mind spinning with everything she had just learned, unable to shake the image of his face, as he spoke of his sister. The way grief, and something else entirely, something warmer, and more uncertain, had moved across his features in equal measure. She did not know it yet, but that brief exchange in the gallery had planted a seed that would grow steadily, in the days ahead, drawing the Duke back toward her again, and again, under increasingly thin excuses, each encounter chipping away, however slowly, at the wall of ice he had spent 8 long years building around himself. Word of the encounter in the gallery reached Lady Margaret Hartley within a single day, carried, as most things were in that house, through the careful network of servants, who reported everything of interest to whichever family member paid closest attention. Lady Margaret was the Duke's aunt, his late father's sister, and she had lived at Hartley Manor for the better part of a decade, ever since her own husband's death had left her with a modest income and a great deal of time to occupy herself with the affairs of others. She received the news over her morning tea, delivered in careful, measured tones by her personal maid, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy, who had served Lady Margaret long enough to know precisely how much detail her mistress preferred, and precisely how much embellishment would earn her a generous tip rather than a scolding. "He spoke with her for nearly a quarter of an hour, my lady," Dorothy said, setting down the tea tray with practiced care. One of the footmen saw them in the long gallery, standing before Lady Charlotte's portrait. Lady Margaret set down her cup with a click against its saucer, her expression sharpening immediately. Charlotte's portrait. "He never speaks of Charlotte, not even to me, and I am the only family he has left in this world." "Yes, my lady." "That is what made it so unusual, if I may say so." Lady Margaret said nothing further for several minutes, staring into the middle distance with the particular focus she reserved for matters she considered genuinely threatening to the order of things. She had spent 8 years watching her nephew retreat further and further into himself, and while she had grieved for him privately, she had also, in her own quiet way, come to depend upon the stability of his isolation. A duke who kept to himself, who avoided society, who showed no interest in courtship or companionship, was a duke whose household remained predictable, whose finances remained under careful management, and whose eventual heir would, by simple necessity, require guidance from someone with experience and standing. Someone very much like herself. A sudden and unexplained interest in a housemaid threatened all of that in ways Lady Margaret found deeply unsettling. "Has he spoken with her since?" she asked finally. "I have not heard of it, my lady, though it has only been a day." "Keep your ears open, Dorothy. I wish to know immediately if this continues." Dorothy curtsied and withdrew, leaving Lady Margaret alone with her cooling tea and her growing unease. She was not a cruel woman by nature, or so she told herself, but she had survived long enough in a world that offered little security to widows of modest means to understand that comfort, once achieved, needed to be protected fiercely and without sentiment. If her nephew's sudden interest in a servant girl was allowed to grow unchecked, there was no telling what foolishness might follow. And foolishness, in Lady Margaret's experience, tended to end in scandal, and scandal tended to end in ruin for everyone connected to the family name. She resolved, over the remainder of her tea, to observe the situation closely before deciding how best to intervene. Meanwhile, in the East Wing study, the Duke found himself returning to his desk with far less focus than usual. He had a stack of correspondence awaiting his attention, letters from tenants regarding repairs needed before the winter set in, a request from the local magistrate concerning a boundary dispute between 2 neighboring farms, and a letter from his solicitor regarding certain investments that required his signature by the end of the week. Ordinarily, he moved through such correspondence with brisk efficiency, answering each matter with the same clear, decisive judgment that had earned him a reputation throughout the county as a fair, if distant, landlord. Today, however, his attention kept drifting toward the chair across the room, and toward the memory of a quiet housemaid asleep in it, her exhaustion so complete that she had not even stirred at the sound of the door opening. He found himself wondering, unbidden, what circumstances had left her so thoroughly worn down, what burdens she carried that had not been apparent to him before. Despite the fact that she had worked in this house for, he now realized, he did not actually know how long. He rang the small bell on his desk, summoning his valet, a quiet, efficient man named Peter Doyle, who had served him faithfully for nearly 6 years, and had learned, over that time, to read his employer's moods with unusual precision. "You rang, Your Grace." "Doyle, how long has Miss Bennet been employed in this household?" If Doyle found the question unusual, he gave no outward sign of it, his expression remaining perfectly professional. "I believe close to 2 years, Your Grace. She came recommended by the vicar in the village, where her family resides, if I recall correctly." "And her family. What do you know of them?" "Only that her father passed some years ago, Your Grace, leaving her mother with several younger children to raise. Miss Bennet sends a portion of her wages home each month, I understand, which is not unusual among the staff, though I believe her circumstances are somewhat more difficult than most." The Duke absorbed this information in silence, turning it over in his mind alongside everything else he had learned about the quiet, exhausted young woman who had unknowingly disrupted the careful stillness he had maintained for 8 long years. A father lost, a mother struggling, younger siblings depending on wages sent home from a position that, judging by the exhaustion he had witnessed, demanded far more from her than her age and frame seemed built to endure. "Thank you, Doyle. That will be all." Doyle bowed and withdrew, leaving the Duke alone once more with his correspondence and his thoughts, both of which now felt considerably more difficult to organize than they had that morning. Downstairs, Clara's day had continued much as any other, though she found herself unable to fully shake the strange sense of unease that had settled over her since her conversation with Mr. Ashford in the corridor. She noticed the sideways glances from other staff members, the way conversations seemed to pause slightly when she entered a room, only to resume in lowered voices once she had passed. She understood, without anyone needing to say it directly, that she had become the subject of considerable speculation throughout the household, and that not all of that speculation was kind. It was Beatrice, of all people, who finally voiced what many of the others had only whispered, catching Clara alone in the linen closet later that afternoon, while they both searched for fresh pillowcases. "Everyone says he fancies you," Beatrice said, her voice carrying the particular bluntness of youth that had not yet learned to guard its words. "Grace says it is nonsense, but I do not know. My cousin works in a house in the next county, and she says gentlemen sometimes do take a fancy to a maid, especially a pretty one, though it rarely ends well for the maid herself." Clara felt her cheeks flush hot with embarrassment. "Beatrice, that is not what is happening." "He has simply shown me some kindness because I fell asleep from exhaustion. There is nothing more to it than that." "But he told you about his sister," Beatrice pressed, clearly having heard some version of the gallery conversation, despite Clara having told no one but Grace, and Grace having promised to keep it in confidence. "No one knows about Lady Charlotte, Clara. Mrs. Farrow herself has told me she does not speak of it, even to the older staff who remember her. If he told you, of all people, that must mean something. It means nothing beyond what it was, a moment of shared grief, nothing more." Clara gathered the pillowcases she had come for, and made to leave the closet, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "Please, Beatrice, do not repeat what I told Grace to anyone else. It was meant to remain between us." Beatrice looked slightly chastened, nodding quickly. "I am sorry, Clara. I did not mean to cause trouble. I only thought it was interesting, that is all." Clara softened slightly, understanding that the younger girl meant no real harm, only the natural curiosity of someone new enough to the household to find every small development fascinating. "I understand, but please, be careful what you repeat. Mr. Ashford has already made his suspicions known to me directly, and I do not wish to give him further reason to doubt my position here." The mention of Ashford seemed to sober Beatrice considerably, and she promised, with evident sincerity, to keep whatever she heard to herself in the future. Clara thanked her and returned to her duties, though the conversation left her more unsettled than before, aware now that whatever was happening between herself and the Duke, however small and seemingly innocent it appeared from her own perspective, was being watched and interpreted by nearly everyone in the household, each with their own theories and their own concerns. That evening, as she made her rounds tending the fires throughout the East Wing, Clara found herself approaching the study with a mixture of dread and something else entirely, something she could not quite name, though it felt uncomfortably close to anticipation. She told herself firmly that this was simply her duty, nothing more, that she would lay the fire and leave exactly as she had done every other evening before the events of 2 nights ago had upended the careful, predictable rhythm of her days. The Duke was still at his desk when she entered, his correspondence spread before him, though he set down his pen the moment she appeared in the doorway. "Miss Bennet," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though Clara thought she detected something warmer beneath the surface of his words. "My lord, I have come to lay the fire, if it does not disturb your work." "It does not disturb me at all." He watched as she moved to the grate, kneeling to arrange the fresh coal with practiced efficiency, and Clara felt his gaze on her the entire time, though when she glanced up, he had returned his attention to the letter before him, or appeared to have done so. "My lord," she said finally, unable to resist the question that had been forming in her mind since Beatrice's comments in the linen closet. "May I ask something of you, though I do not wish to overstep?" He set down his pen again, giving her his full attention. "You may ask." "There has been talk among the staff, my lord, about our conversation in the gallery. I fear I may have said something to Grace in confidence that has since traveled further than I intended, and I would not wish for anyone to think that I have spoken carelessly of matters you shared with me in trust." Something in his expression shifted, though whether toward amusement or concern, Clara could not entirely tell. "Servants' talk travels regardless of anyone's intentions, Miss Bennet. It is the nature of households such as this one. I do not hold you responsible for what others choose to say among themselves." "Thank you, my lord. Still, I would not wish to cause you any difficulty." "The only difficulty I foresee," he said slowly, choosing his words with evident care, "is my aunt's interest in the matter, which I understand has already been roused. She will likely seek to involve herself before long, and I would ask that you not allow her interference to trouble you unduly, should it occur." Clara's stomach tightened at this warning, understanding immediately that whatever careful, uncertain thing was growing between herself and the Duke had already drawn the attention of someone with far more power to shape her future than she herself possessed. "I understand, my lord. Thank you for the warning." He nodded, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound in the room the crackle of the newly lit fire beginning to catch. Clara rose from the grate, brushing coal dust from her hands, preparing to take her leave, when the Duke spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Miss Bennet, I find myself curious about something, and I hope you will forgive the directness of the question. Doyle informs me that you send a portion of your wages home each month to support your mother and younger siblings. Is this correct?" Clara froze, uncertain why he would have asked after such private details of her circumstances, and equally uncertain how to answer without revealing more of her situation than she felt comfortable sharing with her employer. "Yes, my lord, it is correct." "And is that why you were so exhausted the night I found you in the chair? Because you take on additional duties beyond your regular hours to earn additional wages?" The question struck closer to the truth than Clara had expected, and she felt herself hesitate, weighing how honest to be. "I do take on some additional mending work in the evenings, my lord, when my regular duties are complete. It provides a small extra sum each week, which helps considerably at home." "And how many hours of sleep does that leave you, on an average night?" Clara did not answer immediately, uncertain how to admit the truth without sounding as though she were seeking pity or special treatment, neither of which she wanted. "Enough to manage, my lord." "That is not an answer, Miss Bennet." She met his eyes then, surprised by the quiet insistence in his tone, and found something there that looked remarkably like genuine concern, the same concern she had glimpsed that first morning, when he asked if she was unwell. "Perhaps 4 hours, my lord, on most nights, sometimes less." His jaw tightened slightly at this admission, and he was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "That will change, starting tonight. You will cease the additional mending work, and your regular wages will be adjusted to reflect the difference, so that your family does not suffer for the loss of that extra income." Clara stared at him, stunned by the sudden, decisive turn the conversation had taken. "My lord, I could not possibly accept such generosity. It would raise questions I am not certain I could answer." and I would not wish to give anyone further reason to doubt my position here. The arrangement will be handled through Mrs. Farrow, as a general adjustment to household wages, and will not be presented as anything specific to your circumstances.
His tone left no room for argument, though there was nothing harsh in it, only the same quiet certainty that had marked every word he had spoken to her since that first strange morning.
I will not have members of my household working themselves into collapse for want of proper compensation. This is simply correcting an oversight that should have been addressed long before now. Clara did not know how to respond to such an offer, torn between gratitude and the persistent fear that accepting it would only deepen the suspicion already growing among the staff, and worse, draw the very attention from Lady Margaret that the Duke himself had just warned her about. But refusing outright felt equally impossible, given the firm resolve in his voice, and given, if she was honest with herself, how desperately the additional rest would benefit both herself and her family's continued reliance on her wages. "Thank you, my lord," she said finally, dropping into a curtsy. "I am deeply grateful for your consideration." He nodded once, the matter apparently settled in his mind, though as Clara turned to leave the study, she could not shake the growing certainty that whatever was unfolding between them, however carefully bounded by propriety and formal titles, had already moved beyond a simple matter of an employer's fair treatment of a servant, and into territory far more uncertain and far more dangerous for both of them. The wage adjustment took effect within the week, quietly folded into the general household accounts exactly as the Duke had promised, and while Mrs. Farrow raised an eyebrow at the sudden increase applied across several junior staff positions, she asked no questions, having learned long ago that the Duke's decisions regarding household management were not hers to challenge. Clara found herself with considerably more rest than she had known in nearly 2 years of service, and though the change brought welcome relief to her aching body, it did nothing to ease the growing unease she felt each time she caught Mr. Ashford's sharp eyes following her across a room, or noticed the careful, assessing gaze of Lady Margaret whenever their paths happened to cross in the corridors. Lady Margaret, for her part, had spent the intervening days gathering information with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who had spent decades learning how to protect her interests without ever appearing to lift a finger. She learned of the wage adjustment within a day of its implementation, learned that it had been applied broadly enough to avoid obvious suspicion, but that Clara Bennet had been the first name mentioned when Mrs. Farrow discussed the change with the Duke, and she learned, through careful questioning of Doyle, disguised as idle conversation over cards one evening, that the Duke had asked pointed questions about Clara's family circumstances that he had never before shown any interest in regarding any member of his staff. It was enough, in Lady Margaret's estimation, to warrant direct intervention. She chose her moment carefully, waiting until an evening when the Duke had retired early with a headache, leaving the house quieter than usual, and sought out Clara directly in the small sitting room, adjacent to the servants' hall, where the staff sometimes gathered in the evenings for a brief respite before their final duties of the day. She found Clara alone, mending a torn hem for one of the younger maids, and closed the door behind her with quiet deliberation before speaking. "Miss Bennet," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular chill of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I wonder if I might have a word." Clara rose immediately, setting aside her mending and dropping into a curtsy, her heart already beginning to race with anticipation of whatever was coming. "Of course, my lady. I understand there has been some unusual attention paid to you recently, by my nephew." Lady Margaret did not sit, choosing instead to remain standing near the door, her posture rigid, and her expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "I wonder if you might explain to me exactly what has occurred, in your own words, so that I might understand the situation clearly." Clara felt the familiar tightness of fear settle into her chest, though she forced herself to remain steady, remembering the Duke's warning that his aunt would likely seek to involve herself before long. "My lady, I fell asleep in the study while tending the fire, quite by accident, several nights ago. His Grace found me there and showed unexpected kindness rather than dismissing me. Since then, he has spoken with me on a few occasions, and has made some adjustment to my wages, along with those of several other junior staff, though I understand my circumstances were part of what prompted the change." "How very generous of him," Lady Margaret said, though her tone carried no warmth whatsoever. "Tell me, Miss Bennet, do you understand the position you find yourself in?" Clara hesitated, uncertain how to answer such a pointed question. "My lady? My nephew has not shown genuine interest in another living soul in 8 years, not since his sister's death and the collapse of his engagement shortly thereafter. He has built his entire existence around a carefully maintained distance from feeling anything at all, and for good reason, given how thoroughly he was wounded by both losses in such quick succession. Now, quite suddenly, he finds himself drawn to a housemaid who happened to fall asleep in the wrong chair on the wrong night, and the entire household is left to wonder whether this represents genuine healing, or whether it represents a man so starved for connection that he has attached himself to the first available person who crossed his path in a moment of vulnerability." The words struck Clara harder than she expected, carrying within them a question she had not allowed herself to fully consider, though it had lingered at the edges of her mind since that first strange morning. Was the Duke's interest in her genuine, or was it simply the product of grief and isolation, finally finding an outlet, regardless of who happened to be standing nearby when it did? "I do not know how to answer that, my lady," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "I have not sought his attention. I have only responded honestly when he has spoken with me." "I do not doubt that you believe that to be true," Lady Margaret said, her tone softening slightly, though only slightly. "But I have lived long enough to understand how these situations unfold, Miss Bennet, and I have seen them end badly more often than not. If my nephew's interest in you is genuine, it will bring you nothing but difficulty, given the enormous gulf between your stations, and given how fiercely society guards against such unions. And if his interest is merely a passing infatuation, born of grief rather than true feeling, it will end just as suddenly as it began, leaving you dismissed and disgraced, with no reference and no prospects, once the novelty has worn away." Clara felt the weight of these words settle over her like a physical burden, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full scope of what she now faced. She had not asked for any of this. She had only fallen asleep from exhaustion, and yet that single accident had somehow placed her at the center of a situation with the power to destroy everything she had worked to build: her position, her reputation, her ability to support her family. "What would you have me do, my lady?" she asked finally, genuinely uncertain and genuinely afraid. Lady Margaret studied her for a long moment before answering, and something in her expression shifted slightly, though Clara could not tell whether it represented genuine sympathy or simply calculation. "I would have you understand your circumstances clearly, Miss Bennet, and act with appropriate caution. Discourage his attention where you can, without giving offense. Avoid situations that place you alone with him unnecessarily. And should his interest continue to grow despite your best efforts, come to me directly, so that we might discuss how best to manage the situation before it grows beyond either of our control." Clara did not know how to interpret this final instruction, uncertain whether it represented genuine concern for her well-being, or simply Lady Margaret's determination to maintain oversight of a situation she found threatening to the stability of the household. "I understand, my lady. Thank you for speaking with me so plainly." "See that you remember it," Lady Margaret said, and with that, she turned and left the room as abruptly as she had entered it, leaving Clara alone, with her mending and her thoughts, both now considerably more tangled than before. She did not sleep well that night, turning Lady Margaret's warnings over in her mind long after Grace had drifted off in the bed beside her own. Every word carried the ring of truth, however unwelcome, and Clara found herself unable to dismiss the possibility that the Duke's sudden interest in her represented nothing more than a grieving man's momentary need for connection, destined to fade as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in its wake. And yet, when she thought of his face in the gallery, the quiet grief in his voice as he spoke of his sister, the careful, deliberate way he had arranged for her wages to be adjusted without drawing undue attention to her specifically, none of it felt like the careless attention of a man simply seeking distraction from his sorrow. It felt, if anything, like the careful, tentative movements of someone relearning how to care about another person after years of deliberately avoiding exactly that. She resolved, as sleep finally began to claim her, to follow Lady Margaret's advice as best she could, to maintain proper distance where possible, and to avoid giving the household further reason for gossip or suspicion. It seemed the wisest course, given everything at stake, and given how little control she actually held over how the Duke chose to behave toward her. Her resolve, however, proved considerably harder to maintain than she anticipated. The following morning, As she made her way to the kitchens for the day's instructions, she found Mr. Ashford waiting near the servants' entrance, his expression carrying its usual sharp disapproval, though today it seemed edged with something closer to satisfaction, as though he had been anticipating this particular conversation. "Miss Bennet," he said, falling into step beside her as she walked, "I understand Lady Margaret spoke with you last evening." Clara's stomach tightened immediately, wondering how word of that private conversation had already reached the steward. "Yes, Mr. Ashford." "Good. I trust she made the situation clear to you." He paused, studying her with the same assessing gaze he had used during their previous conversation in the corridor. "I will speak plainly, Miss Bennet, since subtlety does not appear to have served its purpose thus far. This household has functioned with clear order and discipline for many years, precisely because everyone understands their place within it, and precisely because His Grace has never permitted personal considerations to interfere with the proper management of his estate. Whatever has occurred between yourself and His Grace threatens that order, regardless of how innocently it began." "I have done nothing to encourage his attention, Mr. Ashford," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whether you have encouraged it or not is frankly irrelevant to my concerns," Ashford replied. "What matters is the effect it has already had on this household. Staff are distracted by gossip. Lady Margaret has been forced to intervene directly, which she has not done regarding any household matter in years, and His Grace himself appears increasingly preoccupied with matters that have nothing to do with the responsibilities of his position." He paused, his expression growing colder still. "I would suggest, Miss Bennet, that the wisest course for everyone involved would be your transfer to a different household. I have contacts in several respectable estates who would welcome a hard-working maid with good references, and I would be willing to arrange such a transfer quickly and quietly, with no harm to your reputation whatsoever." Clara stopped walking, staring at him in genuine shock. "You wish for me to leave Hartley Manor entirely? I believe it would resolve this situation cleanly, before it grows into something considerably more damaging for everyone involved, yourself included." His tone remained perfectly reasonable, almost kind, though Clara understood immediately that beneath the reasonable surface lay a clear threat, however carefully disguised. "You would lose nothing by such a transfer, Miss Bennet. Indeed, you would likely find yourself in a household with considerably less complication and considerably less risk to your future prospects." "I would need to consider such a significant decision carefully, Mr. Ashford," Clara said finally, unwilling to commit to anything so drastic without further thought, though equally unwilling to reveal how deeply his suggestion had unsettled her. "I could not agree to leave my position without proper reflection." "Of course," Ashford said, his tone suggesting he had expected exactly this response, and had already planned his next move accordingly. "Take whatever time you require, Miss Bennet, but I would encourage you not to take too long. Situations such as this rarely improve with additional time. They tend, in my experience, only to grow more complicated and more painful for everyone involved." He inclined his head slightly and continued down the corridor, leaving Clara standing alone, her mind racing through everything she had just heard, and everything it might mean for her future, both within Hartley Manor and beyond it. Between Lady Margaret's warnings and Ashford's not-so-subtle threat of transfer, she found herself caught between two powerful figures within the household, each determined, for their own reasons, to see the strange, uncertain connection between herself and the Duke brought to an end, before it could grow into something neither of them could control. She did not know, as she finally continued on toward the kitchens, that similar pressures were already beginning to reach the Duke himself, delivered through channels far more direct than anything applied to a mere housemaid, and that the coming days would test both of them in ways neither had yet begun to anticipate. Lady Margaret found her nephew in the small library adjoining the main hall that same afternoon, seated before a fire with a book open on his lap, though he had not turned a single page in nearly 20 minutes, his attention clearly elsewhere. She entered without waiting to be announced, closing the door firmly behind her, and took the chair opposite his own, without invitation. "Edmund," she said, using the familiarity of family rather than his formal title, a habit she reserved for moments she considered particularly serious. "We must speak plainly about Miss Bennet." He set down his book slowly, his expression settling into the careful neutrality he had perfected over years of guarding his private thoughts from scrutiny. "I wondered when this conversation would come, Aunt Margaret. Then you will not be surprised by what I have to say." She folded her hands in her lap, her posture perfectly composed despite the tension evident in her voice. You have shown more genuine attention to that girl in the past week than you have shown to anyone, myself included, in the 8 years since Charlotte's death and Eleanor's departure. I understand why this might feel like healing to you, Edmund. I understand the appeal of finding warmth again after so long spent in the cold. But I must ask you to consider, honestly and carefully, what you believe you are building here, and what it will cost, both to yourself and to her, should this continue. I have not decided that I am building anything, Aunt Margaret, he said, though his voice lacked its usual firm certainty. I have simply found myself, unexpectedly, in conversation with someone who does not treat me as though I were made of glass, liable to shatter at the slightest provocation. Every member of this household, yourself included, has spent 8 years handling me with such careful delicacy that I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to as an ordinary man, rather than a wound that must not be reopened. Lady Margaret's expression softened slightly at this admission, though she did not abandon her purpose. And is that truly what you have found in her, Edmund? Or have you simply found the first person in 8 years who did not know enough of your history to treat you with such caution? Because if it is the latter, I fear you are mistaking novelty for genuine connection, and the difference matters enormously, both for your own well-being and for hers. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he considered his aunt's question with evident seriousness. I have asked myself the same thing, more than once, since that first morning. I do not have a certain answer for you. I only know that when I am in her presence, I find myself thinking of something other than grief for the first time in longer than I care to admit, and I find that I do not wish to return to the alternative. Even if pursuing this connection destroys her position in this household and her prospects beyond it, Lady Margaret pressed, even if society condemns you both for the difference in your stations, and she bears the greater share of that condemnation, as women in her position always do, you are a duke, Edmund. Your choices carry consequences far beyond your own feelings, and I would be failing in my duty to your father's memory if I did not force you to consider them clearly. The Duke's jaw tightened at this, and for a moment Lady Margaret thought she saw genuine anger flash across his features, though it passed as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something closer to weary resignation. You believe I have not considered exactly that, every single day since this began? You believe I do not understand precisely what is at stake, for her more than for myself. I am not a young man carried away by infatuation, Aunt Margaret. I am fully aware of every complication this situation presents, and I have considered, at length, whether the wisest course would simply be to withdraw entirely, to return to the careful distance I maintained before, and spare us both the difficulty that continuing this connection would inevitably bring. And yet you have not withdrawn, Lady Margaret observed quietly. No, he admitted, I have not. Then I must ask you directly, Edmund, because I do not believe you have yet answered the question honestly, even to yourself. What is it that you intend to do about this? Because I promise you, the household will not remain patient much longer. Ashford has already spoken to me of arranging a transfer for the girl, to remove the complication before it grows beyond manageable proportions. And I confess I did not discourage him from pursuing the idea, given the concerns I have just expressed to you. The Duke's head snapped up at this, his expression shifting from weary consideration to something far sharper, far more alert. Ashford intends to transfer her to another household entirely? He believes it would resolve the situation cleanly, before further gossip spreads, and I confess, I saw merit in the suggestion, given everything I have just said to you. Without consulting me? The Duke rose from his chair, his composure cracking for the first time since his aunt had entered the room, revealing an intensity of feeling that clearly startled even Lady Margaret, who had known him her entire life, and had never once seen him respond with such immediate, unguarded urgency to anything. Ashford does not have the authority to arrange the transfer of any member of this household without my direct approval, Aunt Margaret, and you know this perfectly well. I know it, Lady Margaret said, though she did not back down from his sudden intensity. But I also know that your reaction just now has told me more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much this girl has come to matter to you, Edmund. Look at yourself. You have not shown this much genuine emotion about anything in 8 years, and it took the mere suggestion of her removal from this household to draw it forth. The Duke stood very still for a long moment, clearly recognizing the truth in his aunt's observation, though he said nothing in immediate response. Finally, he moved toward the window, his back to her, his shoulders set in the rigid posture Lady Margaret recognized as his way of gathering his thoughts before speaking on matters that touched him most deeply. "I do not know what this is, Aunt Margaret," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I do not know whether it is genuine affection, or grief seeking an outlet, or simple gratitude toward someone who treated me, however briefly, as an ordinary man, rather than a tragedy to be handled with care. I only know that the thought of her being sent away, quietly, without my knowledge, filled me with an anger I have not felt in years, and that response alone tells me this has already become something I am not prepared to simply set aside." Lady Margaret studied her nephew's rigid back for a long moment, her own expression softening into something closer to genuine sympathy, despite her continued reservations about the practical difficulties such a connection would present. "Then I would suggest, Edmund, that you speak with her directly, honestly, before Ashford or anyone else takes matters further into their own hands. Whatever this is, whatever it may become, it deserves better than to be decided by servants' gossip and a steward's overreach." The Duke turned back to face her, something in his expression settling into a resolve Lady Margaret had not seen in him in many years. "You are right. I will speak with Ashford myself, immediately, and make clear that no member of this household will be transferred, dismissed, or otherwise removed, without my direct knowledge and approval. And I will speak with Miss Bennet as well, to understand her own thoughts on the matter, rather than allowing others to decide her future on her behalf." "Edmund," Lady Margaret said, rising from her chair as he moved toward the door, "I have expressed my concerns plainly, and I stand by every word of them. But I have also known you your entire life, and I have watched you carry a grief these past 8 years that has hollowed you out in ways I have grieved for privately, unable to help you find your way back to yourself. If this girl has genuinely given you a path back toward feeling something other than sorrow, then perhaps my concerns matter less than I believed a moment ago. I ask only that you proceed with care, for both your sakes." The Duke paused at the door, looking back at his aunt with an expression of genuine gratitude that softened his features in a way Lady Margaret had nearly forgotten he was capable of. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. I will proceed carefully. I promise you that." He found Ashford within the hour, in the steward's small office adjoining the main hall, poring over the household accounts with his usual meticulous attention. The steward looked up in evident surprise when the Duke entered without announcement, his expression quickly shifting to careful professionalism as he rose from his desk. "Your Grace, I did not expect you this afternoon. I understand you have been discussing the transfer of Miss Bennet to another household," the Duke said, his voice carrying a coldness Ashford had not heard, directed toward himself in all his years of service. "I would like you to explain to me precisely why you believed such a transfer fell within your authority to arrange, without my direct knowledge or approval." Ashford's composure faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, drawing himself up with the confidence of a man who genuinely believed he had acted in the household's best interests. "Your Grace, I believed I was acting to protect the stability of this household, and indeed, to protect Miss Bennet herself, from a situation that had already begun to generate considerable gossip and speculation among the staff. I intended, of course, to inform you of the arrangement once finalized, but I judged it wiser to move quickly, before the situation grew more complicated." "You judged," the Duke repeated, his tone flat. "You do not have the authority to judge matters of staff transfer without my explicit approval, Ashford. And I would remind you of that fact clearly, so there is no confusion in the future. Miss Bennet will remain in this household for as long as she wishes to remain here, and any decision regarding her position, her wages, or her continued employment will be made by me directly, or not at all. Your Grace, I meant no disrespect. I only sought to prevent further difficulty, for the household and for the young lady herself. Then in the future, Ashford, you will bring your concerns directly to me, rather than taking unilateral action, or discussing such matters with my aunt, before I myself have had opportunity to consider them." The Duke's voice remained level, though the underlying warning was unmistakable. "I trust I have made myself sufficiently clear." "Perfectly clear, Your Grace," Ashford said, his expression carefully composed, despite the evident sting of the reprimand. "It will not happen again." The Duke nodded once and left the office without further comment, leaving Ashford standing alone at his desk, his earlier confidence considerably shaken, though his private suspicions about the wisdom of the Duke's growing attachment to Clara Bennet remained entirely unchanged, tucked away now, beneath a more careful outward compliance that Ashford intended to maintain, for the time being, while he waited to see how the situation continued to unfold. That evening, as the household settled into its usual rhythms, the Duke made his way to the East Wing study earlier than usual, arriving well before Clara's typical time for tending the evening fires. He found himself pacing the length of the room, rehearsing words he had never before needed to prepare, uncertain exactly how to voice the tangled feelings that had overtaken him so completely since that first strange morning. When Clara finally arrived, carrying her usual basket of fresh coal, she stopped short in the doorway, upon finding him already present, his expression carrying an intensity that immediately told her something significant had occurred since their last conversation. "My lord," she said carefully, setting down her basket near the grate. "Is something troubling you?" "Sit with me, Miss Bennet," he said, gesturing not toward the servant's stool typically brought in for such conversations, but toward a second chair he had positioned near his own, close to the fire. "Please, I would like to speak with you properly, if you are willing." Clara hesitated, uncertain of the propriety of such a request, though something in his expression, a vulnerability she had not seen from him before, convinced her to set aside her reservations and take the offered seat. "I understand Mr. Ashford spoke with you this morning," the Duke began, watching her carefully for her reaction. "About a possible transfer to another household." Clara's breath caught slightly, uncertain how much he already knew, or how honestly she should answer. "He did mention such a possibility, my lord. I told him I would need time to consider it properly." "You will not need to consider it at all," the Duke said firmly. "There will be no transfer, Miss Bennet, unless it is genuinely your own wish to leave this household, freely chosen, and without pressure from Ashford, my aunt, or anyone else who might believe they understand your circumstances better than you understand them yourself." Clara looked up at him, searching his face for the meaning behind such an emphatic declaration. "My lord, I confess I do not fully understand what has prompted such firmness on this matter. I am grateful, of course, but I worry that my continued presence here has caused you considerable difficulty. With your aunt, with Mr. Ashford, with the household generally. It has caused difficulty, yes," he admitted, "but not in the way you might imagine. The difficulty has not come from your presence, Miss Bennet. It has come from my own uncertainty about what to do with feelings I believed I had permanently set aside 8 years ago, and from watching others attempt to resolve that uncertainty on my behalf, as though I were incapable of navigating my own heart without their intervention." Clara felt her pulse quicken at these words, understanding now, with growing clarity, exactly what he was attempting to say to her. However carefully bounded by propriety his phrasing remained. "My lord, I do not wish to presume to understand feelings you have not clearly stated." "Then allow me to state them clearly," he said, turning to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had never before witnessed from him. "Since the morning I found you asleep in this chair, I have found myself thinking of little else beyond our conversations, however brief, however carefully bounded by our respective positions. I do not fully understand what this means, or where it might lead, given the enormous differences in our circumstances. But I know that I do not wish to return to the isolation I maintained before, and I know that whatever this feeling is, it centers entirely on you." Clara sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the fire crackling softly beside them, the weight of his admissions settling over her with a force she had not anticipated, despite every warning sign that had pointed toward exactly this moment. She thought of Lady Margaret's careful warnings, of Ashford's not-so-subtle threats, of everything that stood between herself and a man of his station, and yet none of it felt sufficient, in this moment, to diminish the quiet, uncertain warmth spreading through her chest at his words. "My lord," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do not know what to say to such a declaration, given everything that stands between us." "You need not say anything you do not genuinely feel, Miss Bennet," he said gently. "I do not ask for a declaration in return. Not yet. Not until you have had time to consider what such a connection might mean, for both of us. I ask only that you not allow Ashford, or my aunt, or anyone else, to make decisions on your behalf regarding your future in this household, or regarding whatever this connection between us might eventually become. That choice belongs to you, and to you alone." Clara nodded slowly, still processing the enormity of everything he had just shared with her, understanding, with growing certainty, that whatever careful distance she had hoped to maintain between herself and the man who employed her had already been thoroughly, perhaps irreversibly, dissolved. In the days that followed, Clara found herself caught in a constant, exhausting struggle between the quiet joy that rose in her whenever she thought of the Duke's words by the fire, and the persistent, nagging fear that nothing good could possibly come from allowing such feelings to take root. She had seen enough of the world, even in her short years, to understand exactly what became of servant girls who allowed themselves to be drawn into the private affections of the men who employed them. Grace's own aunt had told stories of such situations ending badly more often than not. The woman left disgraced and dismissed once the gentleman's interest inevitably cooled, or once his family intervened to prevent a match considered beneath his station. She resolved, despite everything the Duke had said to her that evening, to maintain a careful distance in her daily conduct, to continue performing her duties with the same quiet efficiency as always, and to avoid, wherever possible, situations that might place her alone with him or draw further attention from the rest of the household. It felt to her the only sensible course, given everything at stake, and given how little genuine security her position offered against the enormous consequences of a connection that could not, by any reasonable measure, end well for someone in her circumstances. Her resolve was tested almost immediately, when Lady Margaret arrived at Hartley Manor's breakfast table 3 mornings later, with an announcement that sent a ripple of interest through the entire household. "I have invited the Ashworth family to visit for a fortnight," Lady Margaret announced to her nephew over the morning correspondence, her tone carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who believed she had found an elegant solution to a persistent problem. "Lord Ashworth's daughter, Miss Frances Ashworth, is by all accounts a delightful young woman, well-educated, of excellent family, and unmarried at 23, which I am told has become something of a concern to her father, given her advancing age." The Duke set down his cup with careful precision, understanding immediately the purpose behind his aunt's sudden interest in hosting guests, a practice he had actively discouraged for the better part of 8 years. "Aunt Margaret, I trust you understand that I have no particular interest in courtship, regardless of Miss Ashworth's evident charms." "I understand no such thing," Lady Margaret replied smoothly. "I understand that you are a duke with an estate that requires an heir, and a family name that has gone without proper continuation for far too long, given your continued reluctance to consider marriage. Miss Ashworth's visit need not obligate you to anything, Edmund. I simply believe it would do you good to spend time in the company of someone of appropriate standing, someone who might remind you of the world beyond the walls of this house, and beyond whatever complications currently occupy your attention." The Duke understood the pointed reference to Clara embedded within his aunt's carefully chosen words, and he felt his jaw tighten with the same frustration that had marked their earlier conversation in the library. "I have already made my feelings on this matter clear, Aunt Margaret." "And I have made mine equally clear," Lady Margaret said, her voice softening slightly, though her resolve remained evident. "I do not seek to force your hand, Edmund. I only wish for you to consider all your options with a clear mind, rather than allowing a single unexpected connection to close off every other possibility before you have had proper opportunity to weigh them. Miss Ashworth arrives in 3 days. I ask only that you receive her with the courtesy her family's standing deserves." The Duke could find no reasonable objection to such a modest request, however much he suspected the deeper purpose behind it, and he agreed, with evident reluctance, to receive the Ashworth family upon their arrival. News of the impending visit spread quickly through the household, as such things always did, and by the time Clara heard of it from Grace over their shared evening meal, the story had already grown to include speculation about an imminent engagement between the Duke and Miss Ashworth, a match that would, according to the kitchen gossip, resolve the current household disruption cleanly and restore proper order to Hartley Manor. Clara received this news with a complicated mixture of relief and something far more painful, an ache in her chest she recognized, with some reluctance, as genuine hurt, despite every effort she had made over the past several days to guard herself against exactly this kind of attachment. She told herself firmly that this development was, in fact, precisely what she had hoped for, a resolution that would spare her the impossible complications of continuing whatever uncertain connection had begun to form between herself and a man so far above her station. And yet the relief she tried to summon felt hollow, overshadowed by a grief she had no right to claim, given how briefly and how improperly this entire situation had unfolded. "Are you well, Clara?" Grace asked, noticing the shift in her friend's expression. "You have gone quite pale." "I am simply tired," Clara said, though the excuse felt thin even to her own ears. "It has been a long day." Grace studied her for a moment longer, understanding, with the perception of close friendship, exactly what lay beneath Clara's careful composure. "You must not let yourself hope for too much, Clara. I have watched you these past weeks, and I understand why his attention would turn any young woman's head, given how genuine his kindness has seemed. But you must remember what we are, both of us, in this house. Whatever Miss Ashworth's arrival means, it may well be for the best, for your own sake, however painful it feels just now." Clara nodded slowly, unable to fully voice the tangle of emotions Grace's gentle words had stirred, and turned her attention back to her meal, though her appetite had entirely vanished. The Duke, for his part, found himself equally unsettled by the impending visit, though his discomfort carried a different character entirely. He had agreed to receive Miss Ashworth out of respect for his aunt's genuine concern for his future and the continuation of his family's line, but the prospect of spending a fortnight in careful, deliberate courtship with a young woman he had never met filled him with a weariness that had nothing to do with genuine reluctance toward marriage itself, and everything to do with the persistent, distracting presence of thoughts that kept returning, unbidden, to a quiet housemaid whose company had brought him more genuine peace in a few short weeks than anything else had managed in the 8 years since Charlotte's death. He resolved, nonetheless, to conduct himself with proper courtesy toward Miss Ashworth upon her arrival, understanding that his aunt's concerns, however inconveniently timed, were not without merit. He was a duke, and his responsibilities extended beyond his own private feelings to the continuation of a family name and estate that employed dozens of people who depended on its continued stability. The Ashworth family arrived precisely on schedule 3 days later, their carriage sweeping up the long drive toward Hartley Manor, with all the fanfare typically reserved for guests of significant standing. Miss Frances Ashworth proved, upon introduction, to be exactly as advertised, a pleasant, well-educated young woman, with a ready smile and easy conversation, entirely suitable in every measurable respect for a match with a man of the Duke's position. Clara caught sight of the new arrivals only briefly, from her position helping to carry luggage up to the guest wing alongside the other maids, and the sight of Miss Ashworth's elegant traveling dress and confident, easy manner sent a fresh wave of the same painful ache through her chest that she had experienced upon first learning of the visit. She told herself, firmly, that such feelings served no purpose, and that the wisest course remained exactly what she had already decided: careful distance and quiet resignation to whatever outcome this visit produced. Over the following days, however, Clara found herself increasingly present at the edges of the household's activities surrounding Miss Ashworth's visit, unable to fully escape the constant reminders of the courtship her employer's family clearly intended to encourage. She overheard fragments of conversation as she moved through the corridors performing her duties, comments from the other staff about how well-suited the couple appeared, how naturally Miss Ashworth conversed with the Duke during the formal dinners arranged each evening, how Lady Margaret's satisfaction with the match grew more evident by the day. What Clara did not witness, because such details rarely reached the servants' quarters with any accuracy, was the Duke's own private struggle throughout each of these carefully arranged encounters. He found Miss Ashworth pleasant enough in conversation, intelligent, and reasonably well informed on matters of literature and current affairs, entirely capable of holding her own in the kind of light social discourse expected of a future duchess. And yet, throughout every dinner, every carefully arranged walk through the gardens, every polite exchange over cards in the evening, his attention kept drifting toward thoughts of quiet evenings by the study fire, of a woman who spoke to him with genuine warmth rather than careful social performance, of a connection that felt, despite every obstacle standing against it, considerably more real than anything he found himself experiencing with the perfectly suitable young woman his aunt had brought to his door. It was on the 5th evening of the visit, during a formal dinner that had grown increasingly tedious despite Miss Ashworth's evident efforts at engaging conversation, that matters came to a head in a manner no one had anticipated. Lady Margaret, seated at the head of the table opposite her nephew, had spent much of the meal steering conversation toward topics designed to highlight Miss Ashworth's suitability, questions about her interest in estate management, her thoughts on charitable works appropriate to a woman of her future standing, her opinions on the proper raising of children within a household of significant means. The Duke had responded to each of these carefully orchestrated topics with polite but increasingly distracted attention, his mind clearly elsewhere despite his best efforts to maintain proper social decorum. It was during a brief lull in conversation, as the final course was being cleared, that Miss Ashworth herself, perhaps sensing the Duke's persistent distraction, chose to address it directly, with a bluntness that surprised everyone at the table. "Your Grace," she said, her tone light, but carrying a clear undercurrent of genuine curiosity. "I confess, I have noticed your attention wandering rather frequently this evening, and indeed throughout much of my visit. I wonder if there is something occupying your thoughts that I might help address, or whether I have simply failed to provide sufficiently engaging conversation." The Duke, caught genuinely off guard by such direct address, took a moment to compose his response, aware of his aunt's sharp attention and the careful silence that had fallen over the rest of the table. "Miss Ashworth, I apologize sincerely if my attention has appeared divided this evening. You have been nothing but gracious company throughout your visit, and any distraction on my part reflects no failing on your part whatsoever." "Then perhaps you might tell me directly what does occupy your thoughts," Miss Ashworth pressed gently, "since I find myself genuinely curious, Your Grace, and I would rather understand the truth of the matter than continue guessing at explanations that may not serve either of us particularly well." The Duke hesitated, aware that whatever answer he provided would carry significant consequences, both for his relationship with his aunt and for the delicate social dance that had brought Miss Ashworth to his table in the first place. He glanced briefly toward his aunt, whose expression had grown tight with evident anticipation, before turning his full attention back to Miss Ashworth herself. "I will speak honestly, Miss Ashworth, since you have asked so directly, and since I believe you deserve honesty rather than continued evasion. I have found myself, in recent weeks, drawn toward a connection I did not anticipate and did not seek, one that complicates considerably any pursuit of the match my aunt has clearly hoped this visit might encourage. I would not wish to continue this courtship under false pretenses, when my own feelings remain genuinely uncertain regarding what I am prepared to offer you, or any woman, given the complications currently occupying my thoughts." A stunned silence fell over the table, Lady Margaret's expression shifting rapidly, from anticipation to something closer to horror, as she processed the full implication of her nephew's admission, delivered with such uncharacteristic directness, in front of guests, whose good opinion mattered considerably to the family's continued social standing. Miss Ashworth, for her part, absorbed this admission with a grace that spoke well of her character, her expression settling into something closer to genuine understanding, rather than the offense Lady Margaret had clearly feared. "I appreciate your honesty, Your Grace, more than you might realize. I confess I have wondered, throughout this visit, whether your attention lay elsewhere, and I would far rather understand the truth now than continue a courtship built on pretense that could only end poorly for us both." "Francis," her father interjected sharply from further down the table, his expression carrying evident displeasure at the turn the conversation had taken. "I do not believe this is the appropriate venue for such candid discussion. Father, I believe His Grace has done us both a genuine kindness by speaking honestly, rather than continuing to entertain a match his heart is clearly not prepared to pursue," Miss Ashworth replied, her composure remarkably steady, despite the evident tension surrounding the table. "I would rather understand this now than discover it after considerably more time and expectation had been invested." Lady Margaret, recovering some of her composure, attempted to smooth over the moment with practiced social grace. "Edmund, surely this matter can be discussed more privately, at a more appropriate time, rather than—" "No, Aunt Margaret," the Duke interrupted, his voice carrying the same firm resolve he had shown in his conversation with Ashford days earlier. "I believe Miss Ashworth deserves honesty, delivered directly, rather than further delay or evasion, designed to spare anyone's immediate discomfort. I am genuinely sorry if my honesty this evening causes difficulty or embarrassment, Miss Ashworth, and I hold nothing but respect for your character and your family's standing. But I cannot, in good conscience, continue a courtship I know I am not prepared to pursue to its natural conclusion, when my own feelings remain committed elsewhere." The remainder of the dinner passed in considerably more subdued fashion, the conversation never quite recovering its earlier easy rhythm, despite everyone's efforts at maintaining proper social decorum. Lord Ashworth's expression remained tight, with poorly concealed displeasure throughout the final course, though Miss Ashworth herself seemed, if anything, relieved by the honest resolution of a situation that had clearly weighed on her own mind throughout the visit's duration. Later that evening, once the guests had retired and the household had settled into its quieter nighttime rhythms, Lady Margaret found her nephew once more in the small library, and this time her expression carried something closer to weary resignation than the sharp determination she had shown in their previous conversations on the matter. "You have made your feelings unmistakably clear this evening, Edmund," she said, settling into the chair opposite his own without her usual formal composure. "To an entire dinner table of witnesses, no less." "I did not plan such a dramatic declaration, Aunt Margaret," he admitted. "But I found I could not, in good conscience, continue deceiving Miss Ashworth, or her family, about the true state of my feelings, simply to satisfy social expectation." Lady Margaret sighed, a long, tired sound that carried within it the accumulated weight of 8 years spent worrying over her nephew's well-being. "I suppose I must accept, then, that whatever this connection with Miss Bennet has become, it is not something I will succeed in discouraging through introductions to more suitable candidates." "No, Aunt Margaret, I do not believe you will." "Then I ask only one thing of you, Edmund, before you proceed any further down this path." She met his eyes directly, her expression carrying genuine concern, rather than her earlier calculated resistance. "Be certain. Be entirely certain, before you allow this connection to grow into something that cannot easily be undone, that this is genuine feeling, and not simply the first warmth you have felt after 8 years of cold, mistaken for something deeper than it truly is. Because if you are wrong, Edmund, the cost will fall far more heavily on her than on yourself, and I could not bear to watch you cause genuine harm to someone else while attempting to heal your own grief." The Duke considered his aunt's words carefully, understanding the genuine care behind them, despite their uncomfortable directness. "I hear you, Aunt Margaret, and I promise you, I have asked myself that very question, more times than I can count, since this began. I do not yet have a certain answer, but I intend to seek one honestly, rather than allowing fear of being wrong to prevent me from finding out at all." Lady Margaret nodded slowly, rising from her chair with the air of a woman who had said everything she intended to say on the matter, at least for the present. "Then I wish you clarity, Edmund, whatever answer you eventually find. Good night." She left him alone with his thoughts once more, the fire burning low in the grate, and the Duke found himself, not for the first time in recent weeks, staring into the flames and wondering what path lay ahead, for himself, and for the quiet housemaid whose accidental presence in his chair had unraveled 8 years of careful, deliberate distance in the span of a single unexpected morning. News of the Duke's dinner table declaration reached the servants' hall within hours, carried by the footmen who had waited at table, and repeated, with growing embellishment, until by morning nearly every member of the household staff understood, in broad terms, that the Duke had openly refused to pursue Miss Ashworth, citing feelings committed elsewhere, feelings that everyone now understood, without needing it spoken aloud, referred to Clara Bennet. Clara herself learned of the previous evening's events from Grace, whose wide-eyed recounting of the story left Clara equal parts stunned and terrified, understanding immediately that whatever fragile privacy had surrounded her connection with the Duke had now been thoroughly, publicly shattered. "He said it in front of the entire table, Clara," Grace whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and genuine concern. "In front of Lord Ashworth and his daughter. Everyone knows now. You must understand what this means." Clara understood all too well what it meant, and the understanding filled her with a dread that overshadowed whatever quiet hope had begun to grow in her heart over the preceding weeks. If the connection had remained private, contained within the walls of the study and a handful of careful conversations, there had at least remained some possibility of quietly stepping back before real damage occurred. Now, with the entire household aware, and likely soon the wider county as word inevitably traveled beyond the estate's walls, there would be no such quiet retreat available to her. Mr. Ashford, for his part, received the news of the previous evening's events with a grim satisfaction that surprised even himself, understanding immediately that the Duke's public declaration had handed him exactly the opening he had been seeking since his earlier reprimand. If the situation could no longer be resolved through quiet transfer, given the Duke's explicit prohibition against such action, then perhaps a more direct approach, one that discredited Clara Bennet herself, rather than simply removing her from the household, would achieve the same desired outcome, while appearing, to any outside observer, entirely justified, rather than motivated by his own private concerns. He began his careful work that very afternoon, starting with a quiet conversation with one of the underfootmen, a young man named Simon, who had grown resentful over recent weeks, watching a mere housemaid receive attention and consideration he felt should rightfully have gone to staff of longer standing and greater diligence. "I have noticed some irregularities in the household accounts recently, Simon," Ashford said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man accustomed to manipulating circumstances to his advantage without ever appearing to do so directly. "Small sums, missing from the pantry accounts, nothing significant enough to draw immediate attention, but troubling nonetheless. I wonder if you have noticed anything unusual in your own duties that might shed light on the matter." Simon, eager to please the steward and equally eager to see his own resentments validated, took the bait exactly as Ashford had anticipated. "Now that you mention it, sir, I have noticed Miss Bennet spending time in the pantry more than her duties typically require. I assumed it was simply additional work, given her recent favor with His Grace, but perhaps there is more to it than I realized." "Perhaps there is indeed," Ashford said, careful to keep his tone measured rather than triumphant, though inwardly he felt the satisfaction of a plan beginning to unfold exactly as intended. "I would ask you to keep careful watch, Simon, and report to me directly, should you notice anything further of concern. We must ensure the integrity of this household is maintained, regardless of whose favor might be at stake." Over the following days, Ashford continued his careful work, planting small seeds of suspicion among various members of the staff, each conversation calibrated to sow doubt, without ever revealing his own hand in orchestrating the growing cloud of suspicion that began, slowly but steadily, to gather around Clara Bennet's name. He arranged, through careful manipulation of the household ledgers he alone maintained with full authority, for a small discrepancy to appear in the pantry accounts, easily traceable, should anyone investigate, to the general period during which Clara had begun spending additional time in that part of the house, ostensibly to avoid the persistent gossip that had followed her through the main corridors since the dinner party revelation. The accusation, when it finally came, arrived with devastating suddenness during the household's regular Sunday morning gathering, when Mrs. Farrow called the assembled staff together to address, in general terms, concerns that had been raised regarding missing household funds. "It has come to my attention," Mrs. Farrow announced, her expression grave, "that certain sums have gone missing from the pantry accounts over recent weeks. I have reviewed the matter with Mr. Ashford, and the ledgers suggest the discrepancies began around the same time that additional access to that area of the house was granted to certain staff members. I would ask, before this matter is brought to His Grace's attention directly, whether anyone present has information that might clarify the situation." The silence that followed was heavy with implication, and Clara felt every eye in the room turn toward her, understanding with sick certainty exactly what was being suggested, though no name had yet been spoken aloud. She rose from her seat, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Mrs. Farrow, if this concerns my recent time spent in the pantry, I must say clearly that I have taken nothing beyond what my duties required. I do not know how such discrepancies arose, but I assure you, I bear no responsibility for them." "No one has named you directly, Miss Bennet," Ashford interjected smoothly, his expression carrying carefully manufactured concern rather than the satisfaction he genuinely felt at watching his plan unfold exactly as designed. "Though I confess, given the timing you yourself have just acknowledged, it does raise questions that deserve proper investigation." Clara felt the room spin slightly around her, understanding, with growing horror, exactly how thoroughly she had been maneuvered into a position that appeared, to anyone unfamiliar with the truth, genuinely damning.
"I have taken nothing,"
she repeated, her voice growing steadier despite her mounting fear. "I would welcome any investigation that might clear my name of such suspicion." "Such an investigation will indeed be necessary," Mrs. Farrow said, her tone carrying genuine regret despite the gravity of her words. "Given the seriousness of the accusation, I believe this matter must be brought before His Grace, directly, so that proper judgment can be rendered." Word of the accusation reached the Duke within the hour, delivered by Mrs. Farrow herself with evident reluctance, understanding as she did the complicated feelings her employer had recently developed toward the young woman now facing such serious suspicion. The Duke listened to the full account with an expression that grew increasingly stormy as Mrs. Farrow detailed the timeline of missing funds, the pattern of Clara's recent movements through the pantry area, and the ledger discrepancies that Ashford had presented as clear evidence supporting the accusation. "Bring Ashford to me immediately," the Duke said, once Mrs. Farrow had finished her account. "And Miss Bennet as well, separately. I will hear this matter resolved properly, and I will not have judgment rendered based on circumstantial suggestion alone." Ashford arrived first, carrying the household ledgers with careful, practiced confidence, prepared to present his manufactured evidence with the same measured authority he had employed throughout his campaign of quiet suspicion. "Your Grace, I regret bringing such an unfortunate matter to your attention, particularly given recent circumstances, but the evidence, I fear, speaks for itself." The Duke examined the ledgers carefully, his expression giving away nothing of his private thoughts as he studied the entries Ashford presented, the pattern of discrepancies aligning, on the surface, precisely with the timeline Ashford had described. But something in the careful, deliberate presentation struck the Duke as suspicious in its very thoroughness, too neat, too conveniently aligned with a narrative that placed blame squarely and unambiguously on the one person whose growing connection to himself had generated such evident concern throughout the household in recent weeks. "Ashford," the Duke said finally, setting down the ledgers with deliberate care, "who maintains these pantry accounts on a daily basis?" "I do, Your Grace, along with periodic assistance from Mrs. Pruitt in the kitchen." "And who else has access to these ledgers, beyond yourself?" Ashford hesitated slightly, sensing perhaps the direction the Duke's questions were taking, though he maintained his composed expression. "Mrs. Farrow has occasional access, Your Grace, as does Mrs. Pruitt, though neither maintains the ledgers directly. So the ledgers themselves, the evidence you present to me as proof of Miss Bennet's guilt, have remained under your sole and direct control throughout the entire period in question." "Your Grace, I do not see how that fact alone implicates anyone beyond Miss Bennet herself, whose movements through the pantry align precisely with the timeline of missing funds." "And who first raised the suspicion regarding Miss Bennet's movements through the pantry?" The Duke pressed, his tone growing sharper with each question. "Was it a direct observation of theft, or simply a coincidental pattern that you yourself identified, and then confirmed through selective questioning of staff members you had already primed to notice such patterns?" Ashford's composure finally cracked slightly under the weight of such direct and pointed questioning, and the Duke, watching carefully, saw enough in that momentary lapse to confirm the suspicion that had been building since he first reviewed the suspiciously convenient evidence. "Your Grace, I assure you, my only concern throughout this matter has been the proper integrity of this household's accounts." "I do not believe you, Ashford," the Duke said flatly, rising from his desk with an authority that filled the room despite his quiet tone. "I believe you have manufactured this accusation, or at minimum, shaped it considerably beyond what genuine evidence supports, in order to achieve through false suspicion what you were prohibited from achieving through direct transfer. I gave you clear instruction, weeks ago, that Miss Bennet's continued employment in this household was not a matter for your unilateral action. It appears you have chosen to pursue the same outcome through considerably more damaging means. Your Grace, I must protest such an accusation. You will have full opportunity to defend yourself, Ashford, once I have completed a thorough and independent review of these accounts, conducted by someone other than yourself, examining every entry across the full period in question, not merely the convenient window you have presented to me today." The Duke's voice carried a cold authority that Ashford had never before experienced, directed toward himself, understanding, with mounting dread, exactly how thoroughly his careful scheme had begun to unravel. "Until that review is complete, you will consider yourself relieved of your duties as steward of this household, pending the outcome of a full investigation." Ashford's face drained of color at this pronouncement, understanding the full weight of what such a suspension implied for his own future prospects, regardless of how the investigation ultimately concluded. "Your Grace, I have served this household faithfully for over a decade. I would ask that you consider the totality of my service before rendering such a severe judgment based on suspicion alone." "I am considering exactly that totality, Ashford, which is precisely why I find myself troubled by how readily you presented evidence against Miss Bennet without corresponding suspicion toward yourself, despite your sole control over the very ledgers you now claim as proof. Return to your quarters. I will speak with you again once the independent review has been completed." Ashford departed with what dignity he could still muster, though his expression, once he believed himself beyond the Duke's observation, carried a bitterness that confirmed, at least to himself if not to anyone else present, exactly how thoroughly his careful scheme had failed to achieve its intended purpose. Clara arrived shortly after, summoned by Mrs. Farrow with an expression that revealed nothing of what had just transpired between the Duke and his steward, and Clara entered the study with the particular dread of someone certain she was about to face judgment for a crime she had not committed, with little confidence that her word alone would carry sufficient weight against whatever evidence had been presented. "Miss Bennet," the Duke said, his expression softening considerably, the moment she entered, though Clara, still braced for the worst, did not immediately register the shift in his demeanor. "I understand you have been accused of taking funds from the household pantry accounts." "My lord, I swear to you, I have taken nothing. I do not know how such discrepancies arose, but I bear no responsibility for them whatsoever." "I believe you, Miss Bennet," the Duke said simply, and something in his quiet certainty broke through Clara's fear enough that she felt her knees nearly give way with relief. "I have reviewed the evidence presented against you, and I find it considerably more suspicious in its convenient construction than in anything it actually proves regarding your conduct. I have suspended Ashford, pending a full independent review of the accounts, and I intend to see this matter resolved properly, with your name cleared entirely of any suggestion of wrongdoing." Clara felt tears rising, unbidden, at the relief flooding through her, though she fought to maintain her composure in front of her employer. "Thank you, my lord. I did not know how I would prove my innocence, given how convincing such accusations can appear to those unfamiliar with the truth of the matter." "You need not prove anything to me, Miss Bennet," he said gently. "I have come to know your character well enough these past weeks to trust your word without requiring further evidence. But I understand the household as a whole will require clearer proof before the suspicion surrounding you is fully lifted, and I intend to see that proof gathered, thoroughly and fairly, regardless of what it reveals about Ashford's own conduct in presenting this accusation." The independent review, conducted over the following 2 days by a trusted accountant summoned from the county seat, revealed exactly what the Duke had suspected, a pattern of deliberate manipulation within the ledgers that pointed, upon careful examination, directly back to Ashford himself, whose sole control over the accounts had allowed him to construct an appearance of guilt around Clara's recent movements while obscuring the true source of the missing funds, which had, in fact, been diverted by Ashford himself over a period of several months, well before Clara's accidental encounter with the Duke had ever occurred. Funds he had used to cover personal debts incurred through unwise investments he had kept carefully hidden from his employer. When the full findings were presented to the Duke, he called the entire household staff together in the main hall, an unprecedented gathering that immediately signaled the gravity of whatever announcement was about to be made. "I wish to address a matter that has caused considerable disruption and unfair suspicion within this household in recent days," the Duke began, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled staff. "An accusation was raised against Miss Bennet, suggesting she had taken funds from the household pantry accounts. I have conducted a thorough and independent investigation into this matter, and I can now state, with complete confidence, that Miss Bennet bears no responsibility whatsoever for the missing funds in question." A murmur ran through the assembled staff, and Clara, standing near the back of the gathering beside Grace, felt her face flush, with a mixture of relief and lingering discomfort at finding herself the center of such public attention. "The true source of these discrepancies," the Duke continued, "has been traced directly to Mr. Ashford, whose position as steward gave him sole control over the very ledgers he presented as evidence against Miss Bennet. I do not believe it is a coincidence that this accusation arose so shortly after I made clear my own growing regard for Miss Bennet, nor do I believe it coincidental that Mr. Ashford had, prior to this accusation, already attempted to arrange her transfer to another household without my knowledge or approval. Mr. Ashford's employment with this household is terminated, effective immediately, and I trust this matter will now be considered fully and finally resolved." The silence that followed this announcement carried a weight far beyond simple surprise, and Clara understood, watching the Duke's steady, unflinching expression as he addressed the assembled staff, exactly how completely he had chosen to defend her, publicly and without reservation, regardless of whatever consequences such a defense might carry for his own reputation, or standing within the household and beyond it. As the staff began to disperse, still murmuring among themselves about the dramatic turn of events, the Duke sought out Clara directly, his expression carrying none of the careful formality that had marked their earlier conversations. "Miss Bennet, I am deeply sorry that you were made to suffer such unjust suspicion, however briefly. I should have recognized Ashford's growing hostility toward this connection sooner, and taken steps to prevent him from acting on it in such a damaging manner." "You have nothing to apologize for, my lord," Clara said, her voice still unsteady with the aftermath of everything that had just occurred. "You believed me, when belief was not easily given, and you fought to see the truth uncovered. I do not know how to properly thank you for such a defense." "You need not thank me," the Duke said quietly. "I told you once that whatever choice we made regarding this connection between us belonged to you and to you alone. But I find I can no longer remain silent about my own feelings, Miss Bennet, nor do I wish to. What I said at that dinner table, about feelings committed elsewhere, I meant every word, and I find myself now more certain than ever that those feelings center entirely, and permanently, on you." Clara looked up at him, understanding, with a clarity that finally overcame every fear and hesitation she had carried through the preceding weeks, that whatever uncertain path lay ahead for them both, she no longer wished to face it with the careful distance she had tried so hard to maintain. "My lord," she said softly, "I find that my own feelings have grown to match yours, however impossible such a match between us might appear to the rest of the world." The Duke's expression, for the first time since Clara had known him, broke into something that could only be described as genuine, unguarded joy, and in that moment, standing together in the quiet aftermath of scandal and vindication, both of them understood that whatever came next, they would face it together, regardless of the difficulties still waiting to be resolved. News of Ashford's dismissal, and the true circumstances surrounding it, spread through the county with the same speed that had once carried whispers of Clara's accidental night in the study chair, though this time the story carried a different weight entirely, one that painted the Duke not as a man behaving foolishly toward a servant, but as a man who had defended the truth against manufactured scandal, regardless of the personal cost to his own reputation. Some among the local gentry clicked their tongues disapprovingly at the growing rumors of the Duke's evident regard for a housemaid, but many others, hearing the full account of Ashford's deception, and the careful, deliberate manner in which the Duke had pursued justice rather than simply accepting convenient suspicion, found themselves quietly admiring a man who had shown more genuine character in this single matter than most displayed across a lifetime of careful social maneuvering. Lady Margaret, for her part, spent several days in quiet reflection following Ashford's dismissal, turning over in her mind everything she had witnessed since Clara Bennet's accidental night in her nephew's study. She had watched him defend the young woman with a fierce, unwavering conviction she had not seen from him in 8 long years, had watched him risk his own standing and comfort to see justice properly served, and had watched, throughout it all, a man who had spent nearly a decade carefully guarding himself against feeling anything at all, slowly, steadily, come back to life before her very eyes. She found Clara alone in the small sitting room one afternoon, mending linens as she so often did during quiet moments between her duties, and this time, she entered without the sharp, guarded formality that had marked their first conversation weeks earlier. "Miss Bennet," Lady Margaret said, settling into the chair across from her with considerably less rigidity than before. "I owe you an apology, I believe, for the manner in which I addressed you during our previous conversation." Clara looked up, genuinely surprised by such an admission from a woman who had, until this moment, shown her nothing but careful suspicion. "My lady, you need not apologize. Your concerns were reasonable, given everything at stake." "Perhaps they were reasonable in principle," Lady Margaret said, "but I judged the situation, and I judged you, without proper understanding of either. I have watched my nephew these past weeks, Miss Bennet, more closely than perhaps either of you realized, and I have seen in him a man I had feared lost forever, to grief and isolation. Whatever concerns I once held about the practical difficulties of a connection between yourself and Edmund, I find I can no longer, in good conscience, weigh them more heavily than the evident good you have brought back into his life." Clara set aside her mending, moved by the older woman's genuine sincerity. "Thank you, my lady. I know this cannot be an easy adjustment, given everything society expects of a man in his position." "It is not easy," Lady Margaret admitted, "and I will not pretend that every difficulty has vanished, simply because I have chosen to withdraw my objections. There will be those in society who judge harshly, who whisper unkind things about a match so far outside conventional expectation. You must be prepared for that, Miss Bennet, if this connection continues to grow as I now suspect it will. I have already faced considerable difficulty these past weeks, my lady, Clara said quietly. I do not imagine further unkindness from strangers will prove more painful than what I have already endured, particularly now that I understand His Grace stands willing to face it alongside me, rather than leaving me to face it alone. Lady Margaret studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect settling into her expression. You have more courage than I initially credited you with, Miss Bennet. I believe, perhaps, that my nephew has chosen more wisely than I feared. The weeks that followed brought a steady, quiet transformation to Hartley Manor that every member of the household noticed, even those who had initially harbored the same doubts and suspicions that had marked the earliest days of Clara and the Duke's unlikely connection. The Duke himself seemed, in the words the older staff used most often when discussing the change among themselves, like a different man entirely, his careful reserve softening by degrees into something warmer, more present, more genuinely engaged with the world around him than anyone could recall from the years since his sister's death. He began joining the household for small occasions he had previously avoided entirely, a brief visit to the kitchen to thank Mrs. Pruitt personally for a particularly fine meal, a genuine conversation with the stable boys about the condition of the carriage horses, small gestures that carried enormous significance to a staff who had grown accustomed to a Duke who rarely acknowledged their presence beyond the strict requirements of his instructions. Clara, for her part, found herself navigating an increasingly complicated position within the household, no longer simply a housemaid among many, but not yet anything more formally recognized, caught in an uncertain space that left both herself and the rest of the staff uncertain exactly how to conduct themselves around her. Mrs. Farrow, ever practical, eventually addressed the matter directly with the Duke himself, understanding that some clearer resolution would be needed before the ambiguity created further disruption within the household's careful order. Your Grace, she said, during one of their regular morning consultations regarding household matters, I wonder if you might clarify your intentions regarding Miss Bennet's position, so that I might properly guide the rest of the staff in how best to conduct themselves. The Duke considered the question carefully, understanding that Mrs. Farrow's inquiry touched on matters he himself had been turning over privately for several days, uncertain exactly how or when to move forward with the decision he had already, in his own heart, quietly made. Thank you for raising this directly, Mrs. Farrow. I intend to resolve the ambiguity very soon, in a manner that will make my intentions unmistakably clear to everyone in this household, and indeed to the wider county beyond it. That evening, the Duke sought out Clara in the East Wing study, exactly as he had done so many times over the preceding weeks, though this time his manner carried a nervous energy quite unlike his usual careful composure. Clara noticed it immediately upon entering, setting down her basket of coal with growing curiosity as she observed his uncharacteristic restlessness. My lord, is something troubling you this evening? Nothing troubles me, Miss Bennet, he said, though his voice carried a slight unsteadiness that betrayed his evident nervousness. Though I confess, I find myself facing a moment I have anticipated for some days now, and find considerably more daunting in practice than I imagined it would be in theory. Clara watched him with growing understanding as he moved to stand before her, taking her hands gently in his own, a gesture of such open affection that it took her breath away, given how carefully both of them had maintained proper propriety throughout the weeks of their growing connection. Clara, he said, using her given name for the first time since they had known each other, and the simple intimacy of it sent a warmth spreading through her chest. I have spent 8 years believing myself incapable of feeling anything beyond grief and careful, guarded distance from the world around me. You changed that, quite by accident, on a night neither of us anticipated, and every day since has only confirmed what I began to suspect that very first morning, that you have brought something back to life in me I had believed permanently lost. My lord, Clara whispered, tears already gathering in her eyes as she understood, with growing certainty, exactly what he intended to say. I do not offer you an easy path, Clara. Society will judge us both harshly for a time, and there will be difficulties neither of us can fully anticipate, as we navigate a connection so far outside conventional expectation. But I find I no longer wish to face any future that does not include you beside me, and I ask you now, with complete sincerity and without reservation, whether you would consent to become my wife." Clara felt the tears finally spill over, though they carried nothing but joy, understanding, in this moment, that every fear she had carried through the preceding weeks, every warning from Lady Margaret, and every threat from Ashford, had ultimately proven insufficient to prevent exactly this outcome, a connection so genuine and so deeply felt that neither the barriers of station nor the judgment of society had managed to extinguish it. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, my lord, I will marry you, gladly, and without a single reservation about whatever difficulties may lie ahead." The Duke's expression broke into a smile of such complete, unguarded happiness that Clara felt her own heart nearly overflow with the sight of it, understanding that she was witnessing something the household had not seen in 8 long years, a man fully and genuinely happy, free at last from the careful, protective distance he had maintained since grief had first claimed him. News of the engagement spread through the county with predictable speed, and while some among the local gentry did indeed raise their eyebrows and whisper unkind speculation about a duke marrying so far beneath his station, many others, having already heard the full story of Ashford's deception and the duke's fierce defense of Clara's honor, found themselves genuinely charmed by the romance of the tale, a story that seemed, to those inclined toward sentiment, like something drawn from the pages of a novel rather than the careful, measured reality of aristocratic life. Lady Margaret, true to her earlier words, threw herself into preparations for the wedding with the same thoroughness she had once applied to schemes designed to discourage the match entirely, understanding that her nephew's happiness, so long absent and so genuinely restored, mattered considerably more than whatever social discomfort the unconventional union might occasionally produce. The wedding itself, held in the small chapel on the Hartley estate grounds on a bright autumn morning some months later, drew a crowd considerably larger than anyone had anticipated, curious neighbors and distant relatives arriving alongside the household staff who had watched the entire unlikely romance unfold from its very first accidental beginning. Grace stood beside Clara throughout the ceremony, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched her friend, once an exhausted housemaid barely able to keep her eyes open through a long day's work, become Duchess of Hartley Manor, before an assembled crowd that included, remarkably, Miss Frances Ashworth herself, who had written a genuinely warm letter of congratulations upon hearing news of the engagement, expressing her sincere happiness for a match she recognized, with evident grace, as considerably more genuine than anything her own brief courtship with the Duke had ever promised to become. That evening, after the wedding celebrations had finally wound down and the guests had departed, Clara found herself alone with her husband in the East Wing study, the very room where their entire unlikely story had begun. The chair sat exactly where it always had, worn leather catching the last light of the setting sun through the tall windows, and Clara found herself drawn to it, running her fingers gently over its familiar arm. "Do you remember," the Duke said, coming to stand beside her, "how frightened you looked that first morning, certain I would dismiss you on the spot?" "I remember every detail of that morning," Clara said softly. "I have never forgotten how gentle your voice was, when I expected nothing but anger." "I did not understand it myself, in that moment," he admitted. "I only knew that something in me, something I had believed frozen beyond recovery, stirred the instant I saw you asleep in that chair, exhausted and unguarded, and entirely unaware of how thoroughly you were about to change my life." Clara turned to face him, her heart full with everything the preceding months had brought them both, the fear and uncertainty, the schemes and obstacles, and ultimately, the genuine, hard-won joy that now defined their shared future. "I fell asleep in your chair quite by mistake, my lord. I never imagined that single accident would lead to everything that has followed." "Nor did I," the Duke said, drawing her gently into his arms. "But I find myself endlessly grateful for that mistake, Clara, more grateful than I have words to properly express. By morning after that first strange night, I was no longer the same man I had been the evening before, and I have never once wished to return to who I was." Outside, the last light of the autumn sun faded slowly over the estate grounds, and inside the quiet study, the Duke and Duchess of Hartley Manor stood together before the old leather chair that had, quite by accident, brought them both back to life, after years of careful, guarded distance, beginning together a future neither of them could have anticipated, on that cold, uncertain night when exhaustion first led Clara Bennett to fall asleep in a chair she had never been permitted to touch. Within the first year of their marriage, Clara insisted on a change that surprised many among the household staff, though it delighted them equally: a decision to travel personally to the small village where her mother and younger siblings still lived, rather than simply sending word through a messenger of her new circumstances. The Duke accompanied her, and the reunion between Clara and her mother, a woman worn thin by years of quiet struggle, brought tears to everyone who witnessed it. Clara's mother scarcely able to believe that the daughter who had once sent home careful, modest sums each month had returned to her as a duchess, with the power now to ensure her family would never again face the hardships that had shaped so much of Clara's early life. The Duke arranged, without any need for Clara to ask, for her mother to be settled in a comfortable cottage on the edge of the Hartley estate, close enough that Clara could visit regularly, and for her younger siblings to receive proper education, opportunities that would have remained entirely beyond reach under their previous circumstances. Clara's youngest brother, a serious-minded boy of 10 who had never known anything beyond the modest struggles of village life, found himself, within a matter of months, learning his letters alongside a proper tutor, a change so profound that he could scarcely believe his own good fortune, and one that Clara herself found brought her more genuine joy than almost anything else her new position had afforded her. The household at Hartley Manor, too, settled gradually into its new rhythms under Clara's gentle influence as Duchess. She never forgot the exhaustion of her own years in service, and one of her earliest decisions upon assuming her new role involved a thorough review of the working conditions for every member of the household staff, ensuring fair hours, proper rest, and wages that reflected genuine consideration for the demands placed upon each position. Mrs. Farrow, who had watched countless mistresses come and go through her decades of service, remarked privately to Mrs. Pruitt that she had never before worked under someone who understood so completely, from lived experience, exactly what fairness and consideration meant to those who served, rather than simply issued instructions from a position of comfortable distance. Grace Whitmore remained close to Clara throughout this transition, and though propriety required some adjustment to the easy friendship they had once shared as fellow maids, Clara made clear, in ways both subtle and direct, that Grace's friendship mattered to her every bit as much as it had during their years sharing a small room near the kitchens. When Grace herself married, 2 years after Clara's own wedding, to a promising young solicitor from the county seat, Clara insisted on hosting the celebration at Hartley Manor itself, delighting in the opportunity to return, in some small measure, the kindness and loyalty Grace had shown her during the most uncertain days of her unlikely romance with the Duke. The new steward appointed to replace Ashford, a steady, honest man named Frederick Lowry, who had come recommended from a neighboring estate with an unimpeachable reputation, brought a very different character to the role, one built on genuine fairness rather than careful manipulation, and the household staff found themselves, for the first time in many years, working under management they could trust without reservation. Ashford himself, stripped of his position and his reputation, left the county entirely within weeks of his dismissal, and though occasional rumors reached Hartley Manor of his diminished circumstances in the years that followed, working in far less prestigious positions than the one he had lost through his own scheming, no one at Hartley Manor spent much time dwelling on his fate, content instead to focus on the genuine happiness that had replaced the tension his presence had once brought to every corner of the household. Lady Margaret, who had once fought so determinedly against the match, became, in time, one of Clara's staunchest allies and advocates within the wider social circles of the county. She took genuine pride in introducing Clara to society, guiding her through the complicated expectations of her new position, with a patience and generosity that surprised everyone who remembered her earlier, more guarded resistance to the entire connection. When challenged by other members of the aristocracy who continued to whisper unkindly about the Duke's choice of bride, Lady Margaret proved a formidable defender, her sharp tongue now turned entirely in service of protecting the niece by marriage she had come to genuinely admire and love. 2 years into their marriage, Clara gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Charlotte, in honor of the Duke's late sister, whose memory had first drawn them together in that quiet gallery conversation so long ago. The Duke wept openly upon holding his daughter for the first time, overcome with an emotion he had not permitted himself to feel so completely in many years, and Clara, watching her husband's joy from her bed, understood, more fully than ever, exactly how far they had both traveled from the careful, guarded distance that had once defined his existence. As young Charlotte grew, she became known throughout the estate for her curious, adventurous spirit, forever finding her way into corners of the great house where she was not strictly permitted, much to the amused despair of her nursemaids. On more than one occasion, the Duke found his young daughter curled up asleep in the very chair in the East Wing study where her mother had once fallen asleep by pure accident, and every single time, he would simply smile, remembering the strange, unexpected morning that had changed the entire course of his life, and gently carry his sleeping daughter to her bed without a word of reproach. The story of how the Duke and Duchess of Hartley Manor had come to marry became, over the years, something of a beloved tale throughout the county, told and retold at dinner parties and social gatherings, each retelling perhaps embellishing certain details while preserving the essential truth at its heart, that a simple accident, an exhausted housemaid falling asleep in a chair she should never have touched, had somehow managed to thaw 8 years of carefully guarded grief and restore genuine warmth and joy to a man who had believed such feelings permanently beyond his reach. Clara herself never forgot the fear of that first morning, waking in a panic certain her position and her family's security hung by the thinnest thread. Nor did she ever take for granted the extraordinary turn her life had taken since that single unplanned moment of exhaustion overcame her careful discipline. She spoke of it often to her own children as they grew, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of falling short of one's duties, but as a gentle reminder that sometimes the most unexpected mistakes carry within them the seeds of the greatest blessings, if only one remains open-hearted enough to recognize them when they arrive. The Duke, for his part, kept the old leather chair exactly as it had always been, refusing every suggestion from decorators and household staff over the years that it might benefit from replacement or refurbishment, insisting instead that its worn, familiar comfort remained precisely as it should, a quiet, constant reminder of the night everything in his life had changed, and of the woman whose accidental presence in that chair had, quite simply, saved him from a lifetime of cold, solitary grief. Many years later, when their daughter Charlotte herself grew old enough to be curious about the story of her parents' unusual courtship, she would often climb into that same worn chair in the East Wing study, listening with rapt attention as her mother recounted, once again, every detail of that first strange, frightening morning, the fear of discovery, the unexpected kindness that followed, and the long, uncertain path that had ultimately led to the deep, abiding happiness that now defined their family's daily life at Hartley Manor. "And you were not afraid, when you finally understood he cared for you?" Charlotte asked once, curled into the corner of the great chair, with the particular seriousness only a child can bring to matters of the heart. "I was terribly afraid," Clara admitted, smiling at the memory. "Everything about your father's regard for me seemed impossible, given everything that stood between us. But I learned, through all of it, that the things worth having in this life rarely arrive without some measure of fear standing between us and the choice to embrace them fully." "And father was afraid too?" "Your father had spent 8 long years afraid of feeling anything at all," Clara said gently, glancing toward the doorway, where the Duke himself now stood, listening with quiet affection to the familiar retelling of their story. It took considerable courage for him to allow himself to feel again, after so much loss. "I have never admired anything about him more than that courage, Charlotte, and I hope, whatever fears you yourself encounter as you grow, that you will remember his example, and choose courage over safety, whenever genuine happiness stands within your reach." The Duke crossed the room to join his wife and daughter beside the old chair, resting his hand gently on Clara's shoulder as he looked down at the worn leather that had witnessed the entire beginning of their unlikely story. "Your mother forgets to mention," he said, smiling warmly at Charlotte, "that she showed considerably more courage than I did, in the earliest days of our connection. It was her steady, quiet strength that gave me the courage to pursue what I wanted, rather than retreating back into the safety of my old, guarded distance." Clara reached up to take her husband's hand, the years of shared happiness settling comfortably between them, as they stood together beside the chair that had brought them to this moment, this family, this life neither of them could have imagined on that cold, uncertain night so many years before, when a single exhausted mistake had quietly, irrevocably, changed everything.